Hey folks, I'm brownbear. Today I'll be talking about whether boar stealing adds or detracts from competitive Age of Empires 2. Before I get started, let me be clear that this video is not about what you should or should not do when you're playing on the ladder, nor is it about what's fair and what's not. This video is about understanding a mechanic, talking about whether it's strategically interesting and whether its inclusion makes the game better or worse. Alrighty, let's get started with a quick overview. Boar stealing is a pretty straightforward mechanic. In 1 vs 1 Arabia, player spawns are intended to include 2 nearby boars. Boar stealing refers to sending your scout towards your opponent's base and leading one of their boars back to your town center. This is accomplished by attacking the boar, causing it to chase you around the map. Like any decision in AoE 2, boar stealing has trade-offs. On the plus side, stealing your opponent's boar smooths out your Dark Age economy while simultaneously hurting your opponents. In competitive 1 vs 1, players are intended to spawn with herdables, boars, and berry bushes. Herdables and boars are special not only because villagers gather from them faster, but also because they scale better as you add more villagers. Berry bushes feature a lot of bumping, so they have diminishing returns when you add more and more workers. To put this precisely, one of your early game boars accounts for around 23% of your fast Dark Age food and around 15% of your total Dark Age food. That's a lot. It's more significant when you think about it in terms of breakpoints. A breakpoint just means that your resources are not all equally useful. If you want to advance to the feudal age, 499 food is no better than having 1 food. You need at least 500 to click up. A typical Dark Age build, say men-at-arms into archers, might involve building 18 additional villagers on top of your original 3 and then clicking up to the feudal age, costing a total of 1400 food. Removing 1 boar from the player's Dark Age economy means that players can potentially slip under this breakpoint if they don't lure deer, meaning they need to transition into a different build to avoid lots of idle TC time. By contrast, the boar stealing player gets a considerably smoothed out economy, especially if they're doing some kind of fast castle build. Generally with a standard FC, you want to lure 1 or 2 deer, especially if you're doing a drush. Boar stealing not only provides the food of 2.5 deer, it also takes a boar away from your opponent. So far, so good. Boar stealing is pretty great. But what are the downsides? First is that it's a gamble. Unless you're Vietnamese, you're not guaranteed to actually find your opponent at a decent time. Second, your opponent's boars might spawn behind their town center, making it hard to steal one. Third, you're guaranteed to take HP damage, meaning you're in trouble if your opponent happens to catch you in the act. All of this dice rolling happens simultaneously with having little to no scouting information of your own base. You might be 10 minutes into the game before you realize all of your golds are forward, or you might not even find all of your sheep. Even then, since your scout is damaged, your ability to scout the map is a little limited. I think it's for this reason that most boar steals tend to transition into strategies that are less reliant on good scouting, like forward all-ins or a full wall followed by a fast castle. In sum, boar stealing is a significant net positive if the gamble pays off, and a significant net negative if it doesn't. In layman's terms, I would describe this as a sort of YOLO play. You roll the dice, and sometimes you win big, and sometimes you don't. Note that not every form of risk-taking should be labeled gambling. Players take risks all the time. That's because in an imperfect information game with a fog of war, risk is inherent and unavoidable. But the usual risks that players take are far more calculated and skill-based than boar stealing. They're based on what the player has scouted, the player's understanding of the map and matchup, and so forth. For example, maybe I decide not to wall in my villagers against a scout's opening because I think I have a window to outer wall my base before his scouts arrive. It's not guaranteed, and it risks losing 1 or 2 villagers, but the better I am at the game, the more capable I am of assessing this correctly. In other words, there's a skill-based component here, one that doesn't really exist for boar stealing. The pros and cons by themselves make me skeptical about whether this is a good mechanic, but I want to look at this from the perspective of both players. In terms of the metagame, is boar stealing a good strategic interaction? To answer that, I want to explain my personal perspective on what a good strategic interaction looks like. Consider the very standard fast castle build. Let's say you start up a ladder game and you're playing against me, and you see that I'm probably going for a fast castle. I'm walling up early, I've got really defensible resources, I'm staying in the Dark Age for a long time, maybe I'm even playing a Civ with a particularly strong FC follow-up. Now that you've scouted this information, what can you do? Your reaction will sit somewhere on a spectrum. On the left-hand side, you simply don't react at all. For example, if you open scouts, you can pressure around the walls to force out buildings, take map control, prevent forward villagers, and just proceed along your planned route to the castle age. In the middle, you have a variety of minor reactions. Maybe you intended to do men-at-arms into archers, but when you scout the full wall, you decide to also build a forward tower to kick me off berries. On the right-hand side, you have a committed and major reaction. Maybe you transition from a normal opening into a full-on all-in, or maybe you abruptly switch into your own FC build. This to me is a good strategic interaction because both players have choices and both players have agency. I obviously have agency because I get to do the strat I wanted to do when the game started. But you also have agency because you have a range of options on how to react. Those decisions are dependent on things like who you are as a player, what kind of map gen we both got, the civilizations we're each playing, and so forth. You might make different decisions in different situations, and your game plan will probably change as you scout more information. Stuff like this, in my opinion, is what makes competitive Age of Empires 2 such a satisfying and enjoyable game to play. Now, keeping this model in mind, I'd like to talk again about stealing your opponent's boar. Let's say I decide to steal your boar. What are your choices in this situation? First, you can do nothing. That's not really an option because now you're just way behind. Second, you can make a minor adjustment. Maybe you lure deer to cover the food shortage. This is the most common reaction I see on the ladder because even though it still leaves you behind, a better player can still usually win. Objectively, it's not a great reaction because it means you have just as little scouting information as a stealing player. In other words, one of the disadvantages of stealing goes away. And anyway, I can just lure deer myself after I steal your boar, keeping my advantage. The best choice here is to make a major adjustment. You go across the map and counterlane my boar to even up the playing field. While this is also a gamble, mathematically it's probably going to work out. Since I have limited scouting information of my own base, even if you can't get my boar, you can probably at least get 2 of my sheep. Really, the ideal play is to prevent the boar steal in the first place. But aside from blocking being difficult to do in the definitive edition, executing it relies on a lot of luck related to where your scout is when the lane occurs, and whether or not you find your forward boars before your opponent does. You can gamble and follow an inefficient scouting pattern to avoid this, but then you're just outright behind a player doing a normal opening. What you're left with is a strategic interaction where one player gambles and the other player doesn't really have a good response aside from gambling themselves. For me, this is just not that interesting. It lacks agency and counterplay, and lacks a spectrum of acceptable reactions. To put it simply, it's just boring. I don't think the game is better because players are able to do this. Frankly, I think it's worse. A distinction that I think is worth making here is that just because a strategy requires a committed response doesn't mean it's automatically boring. TC dropping, tower rushes, and Celt siege pushes all require committed, disruptive responses. But all of these strategies differ from stealing boars in 2 important ways. First, just because you decide to do the strategy doesn't mean you're immediately ahead. Indeed, in the case of TC dropping and arguably tower rushing, you're actually behind until you force your opponent into a mistake. Second, there's significantly less luck and significantly more skill involved. There's a big difference between my Celt siege push and a 1900 player siege push, and a big difference between a 1900 player siege push and a pro player siege push. Boar stealing just doesn't have this kind of skill ceiling. Another thing I want to talk about is whether modifying boar stealing would be a slippery slope to modifying a lot of things. After all, it is quote-unquote part of the game. There are lots of mechanics that arguably make the game worse. Here I'm thinking about things like killing your opponent's sheep, walling in their gold, or attacking stray villagers in the Dark Age. Does the logic follow that if stealing your boar is a bad mechanic, then all of these things are bad mechanics? Should all forms of quote-unquote laming be patched out of the game? Personally, I don't think so, and I think it comes down again to skill-based considerations. All of these interactions have trade-offs, and your opponent has agency in how they respond to them. For example, killing your opponent's sheep shouldn't be possible without losing your scout to the town center. If you keep the sheep too far away, that's kind of your fault for losing them. Similarly, there's an interesting risk-reward mechanic related to how far away you wall off in the Dark Age. Too far and you risk getting killed by a scout. Too close and you're easily boxed in. Walling in resources is an interesting one because I do think it lacks a skill-based component. Let's say we agree that's true and we decide to solve it somehow. How do we do that? Well, one thing we could do is we could just arbitrarily limit how close you can build walls to your opponent's starting town center. This has downsides. For example, now you can't wall in towers when you tower rush. Honestly, it's just a janky way of designing a game. Next, we could try preventing walls from being built near gold or stone mines. But this also has downsides. For example, how do the Huns wall off in this case? More problematic are map gens where your gold or stone spawns next to your best wood line. Are you just not allowed to quick wall in that case? Do I write some algorithm that marks the gold and stone mines near your base as yours so you can wall around them but your opponent can't? Again, that's a very janky solution. What I'm trying to say is that if I made a top 10 reasons to play Age of Empires 2 video, walling in your opponent's resources probably wouldn't make the list. But that doesn't mean the mechanic can be modified without consequence. As far as I can tell, every solution to it is either unnecessarily complicated, actively makes the game worse, or both. From my perspective, there are benefits to walls being able to exist near stone and gold mines, even if that mechanic also has annoying aspects to it. Let's go back again to boar stealing. There aren't really any trade-offs here with respect to the game's design. You don't need it for anything, and the HP damage is never worth it on your own boars. Removing the feature would change a little outside of this specific situation. It's not a mechanic with trade-offs, it's a mechanic whose inclusion primarily creates problems. Minor use cases like luring faraway boars on Black Forest seem like minor edge cases that are not worth optimizing for. At best, you could argue it's a potential counter-strategy to the better early economy of the Mayans and Chinese. But what I would say to that is that you should just balance those civs correctly instead of needing players to YOLO gamble to be even with them. To sum up, I think stealing your opponent's boar is a mechanic that makes Age of Empires 2 worse. I think if you had the exact same game, just without this mechanic, very few people in the community would be clamoring to add it into the game. I do think there are ways to modify it to work better, similar to the rule set of the most recent King of the Desert. But the gambling component and the one-dimensional nature of the mechanic still don't make sense to me in a skill-based competitive game. I think the best solution here would be to just remove the ability for scouts to attack boars. This would minimally impact the rest of the game, while removing an uninteresting gamble from the first 5 minutes. Alrighty, that's everything I had for today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you followed me on Twitter and Facebook, subscribed to me here on YouTube, and checked out my live streams over on Twitch. I stream Age of Empires 2 ladder at the top 2% level multiple times a week. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.